And that leads us to the 10th and final progression in this course. This progression is in the key of C sharp minor and uses the sharp 6th, sharp 7th, and flat 5th as accidentals at various times. It's probably the most neoclassical sounding of all of these progressions. Technically speaking, it's also the highest difficulty of any of the progressions of this course. That's in large part due to the faster tempo and some dramatic position changes and transitions. However, it's also largely thanks to the overall structure of the progression. If we merely looked at this as a chord progression, it's not doing very much that we haven't already covered. As a composition, however, it does a few new things. For one, you'll notice that it sounds like the whole thing is a sequence. If you look at the exercises I've broken it down into and compare them to each other, you'll find that some of them follow the same or very similar overall abstract patterns to one another. However, at no level is this progression or its parts a true sequence. It utilizes the sound of a sequence, but never actually follows an exact repeating pattern. This, in itself, increases the difficulty of the progression considerably. While your fingers want to find those repeating patterns to take advantage of, to make it easier to memorize, they never quite will. So it's better not to think of this as a sequence, and look instead at these little groupings individually. We'll get more into that as we move along. But for now, I'm going to focus the attention more closely on the technique here by doing a quick breakdown of the progression. The progression starts with a C sharp minor arpeggio, then goes up a fourth to an F sharp minor, similar to a blues progression, as we've already seen multiple times in this course. It then continues to a G sharp and G sharp 7 arpeggio. G sharp is, of course, the 5th chord in C sharp minor, and when we add the 7th to get the G sharp 7, it becomes the dominant 7th chord of C sharp minor. And with those first chords there, C sharp, F sharp, and G sharp 7, that completes the 1, 4, and 5, 7 progression that's so common. From there, we go back up to the root arpeggio of C sharp minor, briefly go up to an E major, which is the 3rd chord in C sharp natural minor. Then we have an A arpeggio, the 6th chord of C sharp minor. We come back to C sharp minor again. Then we go to an A sharp diminished 7th. That's the diminished 7th chord borrowed from the minor key a 5th above our root. That's that same trick we've now done a number of times here. Finally, we end up back on the dominant 7th G sharp 7 arpeggio. Ending this way sets us up very nicely to repeat from the beginning of the progression again, because we have the dominant 7th resolving to the C sharp minor, to the root chord. Of course, you could also just resolve to the C sharp minor chord just by playing a C sharp minor arpeggio or even strumming a C sharp minor chord. While we haven't seen this exact progression in this course, we've now covered almost every one of these chords and transitions in some way or another in the previous progressions. There's one change that we haven't done before, but it's almost the same as what we've done before, just using a very simple substitution. We'll go over that when we get to that part. Now, this is a great example of just how much can be done in one style with the same chords. The possibilities are really limitless, and it's absolutely worth playing around with. I mean, if people can write thousands of unique and distinctive songs based on the same basic blues progression, imagine how many more possibilities there are in neoclassical with just the chords found in this progression. When you add modulations into that, then it becomes much easier to see how the possibilities are truly infinite. As I noted a moment ago, the first section uses a C sharp minor arpeggio to play a mock sequence on all 6 strings. Now, if you've taken either of my courses, the infinite shred method or the infinite sequencing method, you'll be quite familiar with sequences. You'll also have heard me use the term pseudo-sequence. So why is this a mock sequence? While the pseudo-sequences used in parts of those courses don't fit the bill of a true sequence of notes, they instead use a sequence based on the strings of the guitar. In this case, though, there's no repeating abstract pattern to lock into, with the notes, the strings, or anything else for that matter. However, it does sound and look a lot like a sequence with the groupings of ascending notes that descend one note before ascending another grouping again. But if you notice, the number of notes in each grouping isn't the same. We start with a grouping of 4 ascending notes, go back a note and play up 5 notes, go back a note, play 3 notes, do the same again, then we play 4 notes and then finish by descending 5 notes. Another thing to pay attention to is that within this progression, these mock sequence patterns don't always walk through the arpeggios in the same way as one another or even with themselves. sometimes skipping a note or changing a note where another one used to be. So it is in no way an actual sequence, even though it mimics or mocks one pretty well. Now this is true for all parts of this progression. On the first part, you'll see that we start with the first and third fingers on the sixth string. And there's a bit of a stretch there to prepare for a position shift from the 9th to 11th positions. From there, more comfortably, we sort of pivot up to the 13th position to play our now very familiar minor sweep pattern. We'll then tap the 21st fret on the first string before descending back down again. Now we move on to the F sharp minor, the 4 chord in the key of C sharp minor. This time we start with a rolling bar with the first finger on the 9th fret of the 6th and 5th strings. It then goes up to a minor sweep shape based on the 5th string root note bar chord. This includes another rolling bar with the 3rd finger on the 11th frets of the 3rd and 4th strings. Most notably here, in the second measure, we hammer on the 14th fret on the 1st string from the 9th fret. But then we repeat those same 2 notes with a slide using the 1st finger. This position shift allows us to get up to the 17th fret with the 3rd finger, which is immediately followed by a tapped note on the 21st fret before descending with a pull-off and slide in the same way we ascended. Notice that with the tapped note, we're playing a total of 7 notes in this legato run before sweeping down the last 2 notes of the pattern. For this next part, we're using a G sharp arpeggio in the first measure, and then adding the 7th to make it a G sharp 7 in the second measure. The first measure starts with a pretty large jump, playing an inverted third, the equivalent of a minor 6th shape, that skips over the 5th of the arpeggio. This jump actually makes this part easier to play, since we don't need to use a rolling bar. From there, we just have the major version of our favorite 5-string sweep pattern, using a slide at the end instead of a hammer-on to set us up for the next measure. Here, we have a 10-note legato pattern on the first string that now includes the tail end of the last mock sequence iteration, so we repeat the 11th fret and 14th fret with hammer-ons and pull-offs. However, to accomplish this part, we need to use the 3rd finger on the 14th fret so that we can then reach up to the 16th fret with the 4th finger. After that, we tap the 20th fret and descend directly back down, all the way to the 8th fret with a slide from 11. For this next part, we'll be starting with a C sharp minor arpeggio and switching at the very end to an E major arpeggio. This transition should sound familiar to you at this point, even though we haven't done this exact type of chord transition yet. So what's happening here? Well, the best way to demonstrate it will be to break down what notes make up these arpeggios. For C sharp minor, we have the standard minor triad, going from C sharp, E, and then to G sharp. For the E major arpeggio, we just have a standard major triad, in this case made up of E, G sharp, and B. As you hopefully noticed, both arpeggios contain the E and G sharp notes. You may have already realized it, but the B in the E major triad is also the 7th of C sharp minor. So if you were to play a C sharp minor chord while someone else played a higher E major chord at the same time, together you'd be playing a C sharp minor 7. So in a very real sense, we've already done this type of transition several times in this course, just in a different way. Changing to E major basically has the same effect as adding a 7th to C sharp minor, but not exactly the same. Another way to look at it is that we're changing to C sharp minor 7, but then omitting the root C sharp note. By omitting the root of the C sharp minor 7 chord and playing the E major arpeggio instead, within the context of the overall progression, we actually get a more harmonically complex transition. But more interesting than that is the fact that we're able to both get the same effect as adding a 7th and make the progression more interesting by simply omitting the root note there. Now, this is obviously a basic form of chord substitution. As with all the progressions, this one was written to be played without accompaniment. But if you were to play this along with a bass player, playing some bass notes for you, and that bass player held down a C sharp over the E arpeggio, it would change that standard E major into the more expected C sharp minor 7. On the other hand, if you were to play a C sharp minor or C sharp minor 7, and the bass player played a low E underneath it, you'd have the equivalent of an E6 chord, since C sharp is a major sixth of E. Putting all that aside, we also get a benefit here by being able to play a familiar major arpeggio sweep pattern on the final descending part of this section, instead of having to play a 7th sweep pattern. The position shifts that occur in the first part of this section may be a bit awkward for you at first. Look at the fingering and notice just how many times we're using the first finger in the overall pattern. It's quite a few. Watch the demonstration carefully and make sure to take your time with those transitions. It may seem strange and difficult, but it's surprisingly optimized and a lot easier than you might think. For this section, we now use an A arpeggio. Now we get to a pretty extreme version of using an open string to help with a large position shift. We've done almost exactly the same thing before in this course, so hopefully you'll be pretty well prepared for it by now. We ended the last section in 16th position, and now we're suddenly starting in 7th position. To accommodate that, we're playing the A note on the open 5th string, then using the 2nd finger on the 9th fret of the 6th string, and the 1st finger on the 7th fret of the 5th string. Besides a somewhat large stretch in our hammer-on from the 7th fret of the 5th string to the 12th fret, the rest of this pattern should be pretty straightforward to you by now. That is, until the very end. Here we're setting ourselves up for an even more extreme solution to a large position shift. Upon the descending part at the end of the 2nd measure, we play the 10th fret of the 2nd string, and then go back up with the pick to play the open E on the 1st string, which continues a descent in the arpeggio. While the picking hand plays the open E on the 1st string, the fretting hand needs to jump immediately down to what will become 4th position. The picking hand needs to skip a string, and then we play the 6th fret of the 3rd string with our 2nd finger. Together with the next section, this is a transition that will certainly require some extra time. I recommend isolating both transitions from exercise 91 to 92 and exercise 92 to 93, and then working on those together. Here we return again to the C sharp minor arpeggio. From the last measure, we now have to skip 2 more strings to begin the sweep pattern on the 4th fret of the 6th string. The challenges continue here as we move directly into a rolling bar with the 1st finger on the 4th frets of the 6th and 5th strings, but then have to use the 1st finger to slide immediately to the 7th fret before hammering on the 11th. There's not really much of a break here as we play the 9th fret of the 6th string with the 2nd finger, and back to the 7th fret of the 5th string to now slide it up to the 11th fret before hammering on the 16th fret. After that, it appears like things become easier, and they do in a sense, but it's important to notice just how dramatically the Mach sequence changes in this part from what we played in the previous sections. That on its own will likely throw you off a bit at first. And then we have another legato section with a tapped note. Now for the last 5 notes of this exercise, I really do have to apologize. This takes the challenge of this section almost to the point of absurdity. But I assure you this was my best solution available for how to play this without changing any notes of the composition. After everything I just put you through, we now need to slide down with the 4th finger from the 16th fret to the 12th fret, and then immediately pull off to the 9th fret with the first finger, and slide to the 4th fret, and then pick the 5th fret on the second string. This one even took me a considerable extra bit of time to get down, which normally would be a sign that it may be too difficult for the course. But this course runs the gamut in difficulty, and this is the last progression. So you know what? If I can do it, so can you. This is also a great example of what we discussed at the start of this course. The guitar has a lot less limitations than you might think it does. All it takes is a willingness to put the time in, and you can find a way to play just about anything. Of course, that's within the tuning of the instrument, but you do have tuners you can change. You can bend strings, you can, maybe you've got a tremolo system, a Floyd Rose, and you might even be able to fret notes on a pickup. There's a lot of possibilities. Obviously, this will take you some work to get down. But if you really want to take your playing to the cutting edge, don't let yourself get discouraged, and just keep working on it slowly until you've got it locked in. You absolutely can do it. All of that being said, if something like this is just obviously too far beyond your current level, or even beyond the level you have an interest in getting to, but at the same time you'd really like to get this progression down, or any of these progressions really, now would be a perfect opportunity to work on making your own modifications. You can absolutely find some other notes to replace certain notes with that will make the transitions more easy, or perhaps more reasonable. Okay, so if you're watching this, you survived exercise 93. That's a relief. That was the most difficult part of the entire course, so it's all smooth sailing from here. Now you get rewarded with a much easier section to play. Here we have an A-sharp diminished 7th arpeggio, using some pretty standard shapes. The only part of this section that should pose any real difficulty to you by now is the tapped 12th fret towards the end. That's simply because it's awkward to jump to a tapped note so low on the fretboard. But you can easily prepare yourself by beginning to pick closer to the 12th fret before you need to tap it. If you really don't like the 12th fret there, it's just too difficult, this is a straight diminished 7th arpeggio. So you should easily be able to come up with a minor modification to this part to avoid the tap note altogether. Of course, it's also the 12th fret E, so you could even try tapping the 24th fret E if that would be easier for you. It's not going to sound quite as good, but it is still the same note, just, an octave higher. But if you want to play the original composition note for note, I'm not sure you'll find a better avenue than how I have it here. But you might. Here we are now at the last section of the last progression. We go back to a G-sharp 7 arpeggio, and compared to everything we've gotten through up until this point, this is pretty straightforward now. The only part that stands out as being a bit difficult is the reach from the 8th fret to the 11th fret with the 2nd and 4th fingers. Other than that, you really should be good to go with this pattern by now. And now we have the complete 10th progression all together. As we just talked about, this progression contains some extremely difficult transitions. If there was ever a time to work out sub-exercises to hone in on treble sections and transitions, this is the time. We actually made it all the way to the end. This course was by far the most intense and time-consuming course I've ever put together, so I really hope you enjoyed it. While I normally talk to you about how you should take the time to get through each section of the course and perfect everything before reaching the conclusion, it doesn't quite fit as well here. It's extremely unlikely that anyone will go through this course for the first time and master all the progressions and absorb all the concepts right away. And that's no problem. In fact, even if you weren't able to get any of the progressions down at full speed, just being able to go through all of them in their parts, learn all the different types of sweep patterns that emerge from something like this, and see what makes these types of progressions and compositions tick, you should get more than the benefit that you hoped for when starting. If that happened to be true for you, here's my recommendation. Pick one composition, probably best to pick one from 1 to 6, and then just focus on that one. You don't need to get it perfected in a week or even a month. Just set aside 20 minutes to an hour each day, or at least each day that you have time to practice, and run through it. For starters, I'd recommend watching and working your way through that section of the course one more time, and then focus your attention purely on memorizing the entire pattern. Once you have it memorized, you can focus on getting it down, or you can play the entire thing with the metronome at a slow and even tempo. At that point, you're halfway there. You really just need to run through it several times each day, and then you'll start to notice it feeling more and more natural to you. With something like this, amazingly, working on it in this way helps engage your unconscious. If you repeat it enough, your brain will continue to practice it even as you sleep, and you'll start to notice what appeared to be leaps forward in your ability to play it over time. Once it really feels comfortable to get through, start increasing the tempo on the metronome gradually. If you follow my recommendation, you will get it down, and you'll even be able to get it all the way to full tempo, at least eventually, using this method. And you don't have to take it on as if it's like a second job. Once you've gotten one down, you'll find that your general technical skill has leapt forward, and you'll be primed to take on another one of the progressions. After getting one down, you should be able to perfect the next one in about half the time, maybe even less. It's really just a matter of doing it and staying on it. There's really no secret beyond that. Nobody is born with special abilities that make something like this only possible for them. Any advantage that one person might seem to start out with usually stems from them having already spent a great deal of time working on a similar type of skill. Don't forget that I had to work on all of these techniques the same way that you do. And seriously, if I could do it, you can do it too. Anyway, I hope you continue to enjoy working through these progressions. And I'll see you next time.